We have the tech to get food delivered in 15 minutes, but we all have horror stories about buying tickets. The Game Time app gives fans the advantage. Get amazing tickets in just a few taps. Fees are included, so what you see is what you pay. And the Game Time guarantee means authentic tickets at the best price every time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets to concerts, sports, comedy, and more with Game Time. Download the Game Time app and create an account for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply.
Hello everyone, Patrick here, introducing our new guest on the show. This time I had the opportunity to speak to Betty Baxter about her new book, Outspoken, A Journey from Olympic Athlete to Activist. Now, some listeners may know Betty as an Olympian, but I wanted to give some background for her before we get into the conversation. Betty was a member of the National Advisory Council on Fitness and Amateur Sport for the federal government from 77 to 79, as well as a founder of the Canadian Women and Sport in 1981. And she initiated the National Coaching School for Women in 1987. So she's had an illustrious career in Canadian sport and international sport. After many years as an educational and human rights consultant, she wrote this memoir about her time as an Olympian and her transition into a coach and even into an activist today. I think it's a really fascinating book and conversation, and I highly encourage listeners to check it out. It's published by Nightwood Editions, and at the time of me recording this, it came out just a few weeks ago, so it's hot off the presses. Anyway, enough of me blabbering, on with the show.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
I guess we'll start off with the more general question, of course, which for the audience that may not be aware of the book or is just encountering it for the first time, do you mind explaining what exactly Outspoken is or what it's meant to address?
Okay, well, basically, Outspoken is the personal story of my journey from being a high school athlete in a small town in Alberta through to being the captain at the Olympic Games in 1976, then playing a few more years and becoming an international coach, one of the few women in the late 70s, early 80s that was able to coach internationally. And then I was fired from my job based on rumors of my sexual orientation and really turned to how could we make sport a better place. I started a coaching school, did some work with helping women be promoted in sport in Canada, and then basically threw in the towel and worked in other means in terms of trying to help young girls and women have equitable and equal access to sport and more fairness in the system. So it's a personal story, but there's also many, many things that are about the sports system. To my surprise, and those of many readers so far, are still the same 50 years later.
Yeah, I think we'll touch upon some of those elements, right? But yeah, that was one of the things that struck out to me, right? Because a lot of your narrative takes place in the 70s and 80s. And I'm not someone who follows a lot of sports, I'll be honest, in my day-to-day life. But what I do know about it, I was surprised to see so many mirrors to contemporary sporting events that I still see in the news, for example. Yeah.
Well, and if I can jump in there, Patrick, one of the reasons I pushed to get this book done was that I saw the testimony of the Heritage Committee when they first started to look at some of the abuses in sport, and of course the scandals around Hockey Canada and Soccer Canada. And I was watching the news, and first of all, the Heritage Committee testimony horrified me. I was in tears in front of my computer. I couldn't believe the extent of the abuse across sports and how these brave women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s were telling how sport had basically ruined their lives. I don't think sport ruined my life. I learned a lot and I got a lot of good things from it. But the underpinnings of the system that enabled the kind of abuse I heard in 2022 were still there. And to be honest, I thought I have to get this story out. There's coaches being banned in the news. There's news scandals every second news cycle. I have to get this story out so that people know this isn't a blip. This is actually endemic to the system in sport in Canada. It doesn't matter what sport you play. And that's why I'm doing this. it's no longer a personal story. This is the story of how we have a system that people would love to see positive, and it hurts people. And it particularly
Absolutely.
hurts women or young boys. It's not a positive to our culture. And if I could be a tiny cog in making that shift, I'd do all I can.
Yeah, this wasn't a question that I planned, but you made me realize that it's an interesting one. You mentioned, right, the Heritage Committee and getting this story out there all the way back in 2022. When did you start writing this? When did you start writing Outspoken? Has it been a few years, or did it start right around this time? And then
I'll tell you, it's a bit personal. I was very
okay.
ill. I was very ill in 2018. I had stage 3 ovarian cancer, and I'm very grateful to be sitting in front of a computer today. And during that time, I started to play with writing because I wasn't very mobile. I had a couple of hip surgeries before and after. So I had 4 or 5 years where I couldn't have my usual level of physical activity. So I was writing stories about my little horses and living on a farm and community development sort of. And then I thought, well, I traveled all over the world in my teens and 20s. I should write a travel log. And so I started with the chapter on China, and I thought we were the first people to go to China after the 1949 revolution. And let's talk about China in 1973. And as I took that story to my writing group, they kept asking me sport questions. Well, why were you there? How many were there? Who controlled it? Who set it up? Why were you playing? And then I had to back up and basically build my understanding of the sports system as it was then and tell the story. And I give credit to one of the members in my writing group. Finally, she looked at me and she says, this is a memoir. Just write the effing memoir. And I was kind of like, ooh, do I have to? But but by then the story started to get a hold of me. And to be honest, I started to see the path, how my story linked with so many other stories. And there's a million things I could talk about in that process. But I'm going to jump right to the end, because when I had finished the draft and I had a publisher, which I was very grateful to Nightwood, and I had to send my advanced reader copies, the first person I thought about was sending it to Bruce Kidd, who had been an Olympian in '72, was a lifelong teacher of sociology of sport, history of sport. And I thought, I'm going to send it to Bruce and get some feedback. Is he a person who could do a blurb for me? Well, Bruce came back incredibly positive, said, I'm going to get you to talk to the Sport Historians Conference. This is a first-person narrative of a time when we can't find the research. But he also said, you need to get this to the commission that is investigating sport in Canada. And he said, and if you don't know how to do that, I'll do it for you. So I want to do a shout out to Bruce Kidd, because as soon as the final copy was available, we sent it to 3 members of the commission. They did their draft report in September. Their final report is coming in April, and they got a copy of my book in January. And I am so hopeful that that will help them see it's this. They know it's not a small fix, but it will help them see, from someone who wasn't horribly abused by their coaches, but was pushed around by the system and survived it to be a stronger person, there is a lot of things that I can point out that we need to pay attention to. So kudos to Bruce, to give me that nudge. I thought I was just writing my story, and he said, no, this can do good. And that was a big lift for me, which is why I'm happy to promote it and talk to whoever wants to talk about it. Because if we can make it that parents can be confident that their kid, male or female, will have a good experience, male or female or non-binary, I will say,
Sure.
can have a good experience in sport, then that's huge. Because if those parents aren't paying attention, it's a lottery, whether your kid hits the bad side or the good side. And sport can be so good. It can be so good for people's bodies and health and mind.
Absolutely. There's a lot to unpack in what you just said, and I'll be asking questions. No, but I'll be asking questions about plenty of those elements as we go. But one of the things that I wanted to, I guess, start off with, it was one of the first questions, is arguably what you almost end the book with, right? When I first had the opportunity to talk to you and read your book, right, the name Betty Baxter, I knew of your firing, right, which is one of the later chapters of your book. If it's not the last chapter, it's the penultimate chapter.
It's chapter 12.
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
yeah, I believe it's chapter 2.
One of the last chapters, but it's still what most people associate, I think, with your name, or at least the average person. That's what my parents had told me about because they were there back then.
Hmm.
And you know, even if it's the last part of your, or one of the last parts of your book, your engagement with power and discrimination kind of runs throughout the narrative. Right?
Hmm.
And I was curious, with hindsight being what it is, it's almost 50 years now since the events of getting fired have occurred. How would you describe that event to an audience that may not be as aware of it anymore, right? Or who doesn't know what happened and that whole scandal, I guess.
I think context is important, and there's probably as many answers as there are questions when you say unpacking this stuff. One of the answers is sport in the 60s and 70s was still a male place. Women were the anomalies. You could be good, but you'd better be cute and good at the same time. You could sweat, but you'd better still have your lovely earrings and get your makeup on as fast. And I never fit that. I'll be really clear. I didn't fit that stereotype. But it was a male place, but also to shift from just the male-female structures, it was also a place where you didn't dare come out if you were gay. Gay men were artists and dancers. Gay women were butches and taxi drivers. There wasn't a place where you could be a normal life and be out about your sexual orientation. And I want to give credit. I mean, I was not a big proponent of same-sex marriage legislation in 2005, but it turned the dial. Before 2005, there was still a degree of marginalization that was everywhere. You always had to be, just take care. I might lose my job. I might lose my housing. I might lose my friends. I might lose my family. But same-sex marriage, and the brave people that were the first dozen or so to do public ceremonies, it shifted that. And it meant that families accepted their friends and family. They accepted same-sex partners. And Canada kind of got on the world stage as being the most progressive. Now, that being said, given our current state of the world, where division and hatred and othering is kind of the modus that many governments are operating under, we could lose that in a heartbeat. And that's why I wrote the epilogue, in that it would be helpful to think that the optimism from 1990 had resulted in this tremendous change. And my fear is that young people, your generation and younger, think it's a given. And so, as an example, my managing editor at Nightwood, Janine Young, who's a fabulous worker and a lovely person, first time I met her, she said, there's just been an article in the news about 2 pro women hockey players that got married. Why is that even a story? Like, why is that a news story? And I just looked at her and I said, you need to read my book. It's like, it's a news story in 2025 because it would have been absolutely impossible to conceive of in 1980. So that's a context piece, that the power, you can't talk about power structures when you can't even knock on the door with your full self. You have to put on a mask, you have to put on a pretense and make yourself acceptable. And I guess, to be really frank, I was never very good at that. I mean, and I give my parents full credit. I was allowed to be who I was. I was a absolute 100% tomboy. I, wrestled with the boys, played football with the boys, anything I could that was physical and aggressive and competitive. And so I didn't fit. And even though I had what you'd call, I mean, someone the other day asked me, what was it like to be a gay kid in Brooks in the 1970s? I said, I didn't have that language. I didn't even know what gay was. I'd never even seen it. There was no gay people on TV. I might have seen some fairy tale or something, but I didn't even know the language. So I was the high school kid, I was the star of the basketball team, and I went out with the star of the men's basketball team, and my family was like, oh, marry this guy. He's a good catch. And I was like, oh my God, and the last thing I'm going to do is get married. I got stuff to do, so I didn't fit. I mean, I was never ostracized. I just wasn't that girl that wanted to be pretty and get married. Never. And I'll tell you a quick story, and you'll find that I'm a storyteller if I'm not anything else. About 5 years ago, my nephew has 3 young children, and I was on the East Coast visiting him, and the kids were trying to figure out who I was and who was this elderly auntie that didn't have any entourage with her. And so they come up to me and they looked at me and said, "Where's your husband?" And they're less than 5 years old. I said, "Well, I don't have one." "Well, why not?" "Well, I never wanted one." "Oh." And then a few years later, a few days, hours later in the weekend, someone's talking about a widow. And, what's a widow? Well, somebody whose husband had died. They point across the room and shout out, "Like her?" And their parents are trying to go like, no, she didn't want one, remember? So that was lovely because it was just the innocence of young kids.
Mm-hmm.
But it also tells what I'm talking about. Even kids under 5 today meet an auntie in their 60s and say, "Where's your other part?" And so I think we can't talk about power until we actually talk about culture and who has it, who's given it. And, people get tired of me when I talk about privilege, especially white male privilege. But you have to look at who has access before you can talk about activism and who doesn't have access and what you're going to try and work for. So I think being fired really helped me understand that, like at the gut core level. But also being ill helped me understand that. It helped me understand that, I'd been called yes, sir, or masculinized my whole life. But when I was ill and frail, suddenly people saw me as an old woman. And as I began to get healthy and be out and about in my normal clothes, I started to be called yes, sir again. So those things have given me a perspective on not taking power for granted and trying to find ways that we can enable those who either assume they can't have power or assume they don't deserve it. And that, I think that's a challenge that's not very often articulated. We get so siloed. We operate in so many silos, and that's important to kind of let's look at the big picture. That's, again, one of my faults. I can't help but see the whole field. I always see the whole picture.
No, I wouldn't say that's a fault necessarily. I think that's an advantage, right? It can be sometimes crippling in the sense of like you get so big that you can't get out of it. Yeah.
Where do we get started?
But it's a useful frame, I think, of reference, certainly. And to go off of your point of the white male privilege, you saw this in the most recent Olympic Games with the hockey team, right? That whole thing was baffling. That it was even a question, right? The comment that, well, we'll invite the women's team because we have to, or whatever. It was, I can't remember the details of the comment, but it was something flippant of the sort. And whereas it was just taken for granted that the men's team was just going to be there.
And if I can add a Canadian context to Patrick, I wasn't diving into the coverage of that because I was like, ho hum, but I watch Peter Mansbridge podcasts on occasion. And I was horrified. And I haven't watched it since, and I have to, come to terms with this. Jerry Butts asked Peter Mansbridge if they could talk about the politics of sport. And James Moore was the other, so James Moore, Jerry Butts, and Peter Mansbridge. 3 well-respected men in Canada, regardless of your political position. They started to talk about hockey, and their entire conversation assumed that hockey meant the men's hockey. The women had exactly the same circumstances, exactly the same criteria for the gold medal, the 3-on-3. And I'm not a big hockey fan. I mean, I just did a blurb for a friend's hockey book, so I know a lot more about hockey this last month than I ever wanted to. But I watched that, and I watched these 3 men have a serious conversation without even giving. I admit I turned it off. It's a 50-minute podcast. I turned it off after 10 because I was so furious. But they started that conversation in Canada about men's hockey and never used the words men. They talked like hockey universally meant men's hockey. And I thought, sure, those are the kind of conversations we faced every single day in the 70s and 80s. Sport meant men. Sport meant men. Achievement meant men. You had to knock on the door and say, can we have a women's league? Can we have women's time at the ice rink? Can we have women in the newspaper for sports coverage? I've been through that fight so many times, it's nauseating. But to see in 2026, 3 prominent men in Canada so completely unconscious that they were centering themselves, the men's teams, and their privilege as though nothing else existed. I was just beside myself. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity I hope to have a few hundred people just have the lights go on about that, because I don't know if they had a good conversation or not, because I didn't want to listen to them if they didn't acknowledge that the women's hockey team. I mean, I know that there were several clips in social media about women being insulted about the men's hockey in the States, but I didn't think it came up to Canada, because the women's hockey team in Canada has been hugely successful.
Yeah.
But in the States, they've won as many medals as the men in a quarter of the time. And I don't know the stats because, as I said, up to a few minutes ago, I didn't follow hockey. But I was so insulted. I mean, I will really have to give some thought whether I ever want to hear another word that Peter Mansbridge has to say. And in the past, I have quite respected him.
No, I totally understand and I agree. I actually had a question that you tangentially answered, so feel free to, take it or leave it as a question if you feel like you've answered enough of it. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about the book is how you talk about the body as both an instrument for the sport itself, but also as to use the term that you use, right, as a political site of power, right? Sports are political. And I'm wondering if you want to elaborate a little bit on this, I guess, dual position that the body has as instrument of sport and political vehicle, how elite sports shape that perspective.
Well, I think we are seeing that, and I'll maybe start at the end and then come back to the middle of the argument. With the Professional Women's Hockey League, just talked to a friend this morning whose husband and daughter went off to see a game in Vancouver last night and were super excited. And they didn't say it was the Women's Hockey League. They said they went to a hockey game. And I actually said, was this the Professional Women? I didn't realize they were having games in Vancouver yet. Yeah, they just got started and they were super excited. So they were doing the opposite. Hockey is women's hockey to them because they have no interest in the men's. So hockey and soccer in Canada, and I want to give full credit to Diana Matheson and not Billie Jean King so much. I mean, she's awesome, but the women that pulled together and made that Professional Women's Hockey team a viable commercial product. I'm not a big fan of pro sports because of the commodification of people's bodies and the illegal gambling and legal gambling about it. But they are doing things in a different way, and it makes me hopeful. It makes me hopeful that these leagues and the sponsorship search and the spectator search and the build-up are possible to actually address the power that women can achieve through their bodies in a positive way. And so I think that's very hopeful. But again, I'm coming from a very outsider position, never had any interest or any particular investment in pro sports. Personally, my body was my sense of power from as early as I can remember. I mean, I remember my dad building us monkey bars in the back of the house and, hanging off upside down and shimmying up and down. And I had so much energy. And I admit, my younger brother was a fairly good hockey player. And he and I were like the high energy kids in the family that you could not, make them sit down. And, whether it was riding my horse and careening into the garden fence and having the horse stop and me, fly over and end up at my mom's feet while she's weeding the garden, or, being upside down in the monkey bars, or playing at age 7 or 8, a touch football with all the teenage boys out on the boulevard. Because one of my first real senses of political power, because I was always the last picked. I was the girl and I was small and young, but we were supposed to be playing touch. And one of my neighbors was a young man in grade 11, and I knew his brother a little better because he was only in grade 7 or 8, and I was younger still. And I threw myself as a young kid at his feet and tripped him and tackled him in touch football, and he let go of the ball, and my team got the ball back. I remember that. I mean, that's 66 years ago. I remember that as a moment of power. Like, you better pick me on a team because, look, I could take down the tallest guy in the field, and I just did, and we got the ball back. Yeah.
Proof.
Yeah, exactly. So sport always was for me. By grade 4, I could throw the softball the fastest. I was winning the softball throw. By grade 8, the high school basketball coach said, why don't you come up and play with the grade 10 team? So that's why when the book starts with me in grade 11, thinking, geez, if I pick up one more sport, I might get the all-around athlete. Like, I know the path to fame and glory, at age 15. And when that coach didn't pick me, it really was like the first time I'd ever been cut. And what did I do? Took off my shoes and ran around the school until my energy could, settle down, because I was horrified and I was trying to figure out how to deal with not making the team.
Yeah.
So sport and power were always entwined to me. Now, as I got into sport and I saw the power and the misuse of power by coaches and the manipulation, the kind of mind games when you get to play, when you don't. And I was not alone in that. Athletes talk about that a lot. Like, the coach is really effing with me. Like, it's not good here. So I think we understand that. Most people, I think sport is just for fun. But if you're in the climb to try and get, make that better team, get on the all-star team, make a higher level team, it is all about ambition. And like most things that are about ambition, there's twists and turns and cheating and inappropriate stuff, and coaches that will do almost anything to get one more athlete with a gold medal or with a contract. So I think I knew that early. It certainly hit me probably my first or second year, because I went right out of high school to play with the top women's team in the country.
Yeah.
And again, I wasn't compliant. I wasn't the kid that they could just punish and I'd suffer for a bit. Like I say in the book, I was going to protest and then I was out of there as fast as I could. But I think I want to share, because, this connects to some of your other questions. Parents need to not be afraid to let their kid go down a level. Rather than say, oh, those kids are too big, or that kid's cheating, or maybe that kid's transgender, like all these ridiculous arguments. If you want your kid to play more and have more fun, take them down a level. They don't have to be on the rep team. Yeah. If you want your kid to get better, spend more time with them with the ball. Play with the kid. Get your kid into a weight room. Get your kid stronger. Those are the ways to accomplish it, not by complaining to the sports ethics branch that the coach doesn't play your kid enough. So I think the lesson that I hope people would get from the early chapters of my book is, when I was unhappy, I went to the varsity team. It was a lower level. And I went from being player number 6 or 7 or 8 to player number 1. And that team became my best friends. They knew that I would give everything I could. I was helping the coach. And we suddenly became a contender, because the good players didn't play varsity. And so we won the national championships 2 years in a row. And it wasn't until writing the book that I realized I wouldn't have had an international career if I had not dropped down a level. I would have remained a mid player in a top team. And I needed to be a top player in a mid team and bring that team up to a top team. And that's, I can't articulate any intellectual process that happened there. I was unhappy, and I went to a place where I could make friends and be happier.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it was an important time.
Yeah. As the saying goes, it's the friends you make along the way that matters. To put it a little bit jokingly, but yeah.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, dear friends for my whole life from that team and from that era. Of course, your first couple of years university. And what the other team did was it kept me out of that sphere, because it was a club team and it didn't have the support of an elite team, which is never very much. But it also didn't have the mechanisms to make friendships, because everybody was scattered all over the city at all different levels of their careers.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess, as you were saying, this connects to some of the other questions that I have. So I'll ask it now, and again, if you wanted to elaborate, that's wonderful. But one of the questions was, what do you think that competitive sports specifically offers for women and girls? Or you mentioned young boys earlier, or non-binary people, that other environments have often failed to. You mentioned, the camaraderie just now, which is fantastic. But is there anything that's particular to the sports that you wanted to highlight that you really learned that other environments were closed off to, perhaps?
Oh, huge. Women in our culture, which is not that different from the 1970s to today, get very, very little feedback about the strength in their bodies. I mean, if a kid gets on a good soccer team, they have a wonderful soccer experience, and we can have lots of, women's soccer or women's curling. There are sports that are very positive for women, but for feedback where you're rewarded for being strong, rewarded for being fast, rewarded for working hard physically, for being capable physically, That's not the norm most places. And I've been saying this for decades, and it's still the case, although I haven't been teaching young people for a long time. If you ask a 4 or 5-year-old boy, take a broad base of support, they'll go, ta-da! And they want to take big space. They're like, let me at it. I can wrestle, I can run, I can fight. If you ask a girl that's not particularly, she's not from an athletic family, just again, these are average kids. You ask a girl to take a broad base of support, she'll move her feet from about 3-4 inches apart to about 6. She doesn't know how to, even at age 4 and 5, she doesn't know how. Now, there are exceptions. Lots of people will say, well, you should have seen my daughter. Of course, you should have seen me. But she doesn't know how to take space. And then in her life, she is reinforced that she shouldn't take space verbally, physically, emotionally. She should care for others. And I love, and I've quoted for years, Dale Spender's work from the 70s. She used to record people's conversations and classroom conversations. And as soon as the teachers spent more than 40% on the girls, the boys would complain that it was unfair. As soon as in a social environment, she took more than 40% of the airtime, people would leave. The men would drop the conversation and go to someone who would listen because she was taking more than her share. So we have generations of women that have learned, 30, 40% of airtime, dominance, physical space is your quota. What sports can do, and you could name off a dozen, which is great now. You can name a dozen Canadian female sports stars, whereas in the 70s, you might name 1 or 2.
Yeah.
Those dozen or so female sports stars, they learned to take space. And in taking space, they became stronger, they became leaders, they became more powerful people. And I have yet to see something else that enables you to do that in a harmonized way with your body and mind. We have women successful in business, but they better dress appropriately. I want to, throw something. I take the highest, women in business that you know of, and think, what if that woman had been a dyke? It wouldn't have happened in the 70s and 80s. Or even if you take some of the highest sport phenomena, like look at the abuse Serena Williams put up with for being Black. If Serena Williams or her sister had been lesbian, they wouldn't be there. It wouldn't have been just racial barriers to overcome. It would have been complete slamming the door. And so I look at the very tiny feminine women who are lesbian that still wear a heterosexual image because that's how they got there. So I think, again, we have to look at this whole picture. But sport, the reason I don't want to give up on sport is it has the capacity to enable women to feel powerful in their bodies. And I think if we had that kind of a culture, it would be so much more fair, open, willing to take the talents of everybody. If young girls had the opportunities that young men who show some inclination for sport have, it would be amazing. But we're not there. And that's, again, why I'm hopeful that some of these superstars that have helped shape the women's pro hockey and the women's pro soccer, they're shifting. They're not just making opportunities available, they're shifting the dial as to how those opportunities are available. And I mean, again, I give credit to Christine Sinclair too. She's not a core organizer, but she is making herself visible in supporting that. And that's about getting more girls playing the game. Yeah. And if more girls play the game, top 10% will be superstars, but the 90% will learn about their bodies and feel good about their bodies. I could go on, Patrick, about this for a long time. Friends of my sister is in her pushing 80 now, and she often shares some of my writing with her friends. And I had a piece that I wrote about 5 years ago after cancer that was about, I love my body, having my body come back after disappearing. And when she said it with her friends, majority of her friends would say, I don't love my body. Believe me, I don't love my body. Like they didn't want to even, that's not even a concept for them. And that horrifies me. It horrifies me. And I would say the same thing for young men who haven't had the opportunity to learn their body as a talented vehicle. I've always, and again, forgive me for ranting, I have always thought my body was a temple that I have been gifted to occupy. And I have to both respect it, look after it, and push it to be better. It's, I don't know where that came from, but I've had it as long as I can remember.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I And don't apologize for ranting, as you say. It's as far as I'm concerned, this is your show, so
Yeah, well,
take as much space as you
again,
want.
I have to tell you, I often tell friends, if you want me, if you want the dinner party to end and you want people to go home, ask me a political question or a question about sport. Suddenly, everybody's got an early morning meeting. I can empty the room.
So you mentioned a few times in the last answer that you gave the term fair, right, and fairness. And that was one of the questions that I had planned for a little bit later, but I feel like it's appropriate right now, right?
Yeah.
A lot of debates that I hear in terms of sports, and we can come back to trans athletes because you often hear it in relation to the inclusion of trans athletes today.
It's ridiculous today.
Right. Well, that's, I think, where my question is headed is how do you kind of mediate this language of so-called fairness, right? Because I feel like a lot of people who actually use it are, what's the term that I'm looking for? Not using it in a way that I guess fair would be but there's a term I'm looking for and I'm blanking on right now,
Yeah.
but I'll stop and say, how do you mediate language of fairness like this, or how do you come to terms with it? Yeah.
Well, I think it's like what we see in our political discourse these days when people say open and accountable, actually sometimes they mean the opposite. And I think when people say fair, what they mean is they want privileged or special access.
Yes.
And that's not fair. But let me answer this two ways. And the first one's going to be controversial, so let's fill your boots on it. Sport is not fair. There is no part of sport that's fair.
By definition.
People throughout every sport I've ever taken part in, they can, not everybody does, but lots do. They manipulate the agenda. They manipulate the playing time. They manipulate who has access to gym. I mean, sport has never been fair for women. Sport has never been fair for rec hockey players. You've got to play at 3 a.m. if you want to be able to get the rink time. In like you see in my book, if I wanted to do weight training, I had to book a time because the weight room was in the men's locker room. Like none of that is fair. So if you're talking equal access, it gets complicated. I mean, I always think about, I don't know if you ever saw the cartoon with the 3 little children trying to look over the fence at the baseball game, and one has a high bench because then they can peek over because they're only 2 feet high, and another one's tall and lanky and they have a little bench, and the other. That's what's fair. They don't have equal benches. It's fair that they each get an access to look over the fence. And I love that cartoon because it explains when we talk about diversity and inclusion and everybody getting all upset that somebody's getting something special, what it does is acknowledge every single individual is different. Every single coach is going to have different priorities, and it is never fair. And if there's anything I learned as an international athlete, people cheat. Everybody cheats. Now, the soccer group just got slammed because they made cheating part of their culture and they weren't even ashamed of it. But I'll tell you, I'll just give one anecdote because I could give you about 80. We went to Japan a lot prior to the Olympics, and a fellow from Quebec was Canada's head referee, and he would be setting up the referees for the Montreal Olympics. So in that year before, 18 months before, everybody in the world wanted to invite Canada, and if we brought the head referee, they wanted to meet that guy and wine and dine him. In our first trip to Japan, he came home, I'm just going to guess back in those days, $4,000 or $5,000 worth of gifts. There were no rules, but they were just trying to make sure that if they treated him well, Japan would get a pretty good draw, and Japan would get a referee assigned to their matches that would be the referee that wouldn't be biased against Japan. Now, after a couple of years of international travel, our coach prompted us, and we learned to look that at certain times the referee would just make a couple of calls that would throw the game. And we tried to prepare and buffer against that. And I remember clearly, we're in Mexico, we're doing really well, we're 2 games up on the Mexican team. Mexican has a Korean coach. We have a Korean coach. The referee for the game is Korean. We're in Mexico, the crowd is just 20,000 people watching the game. At the timeout, our coach says, be very, very clean. Every play must be crisp. The referee knows this is the time he may give Mexico a couple points. Mm-hmm. We go out after the timeout, every time we touch the ball, the whistle blows. Just for a point or two. Just enough that the Mexican crowd could get going, the Mexican team could get excited, and we lost that game and we lost the match.
Mm.
And it was, and I'm not saying 100%, if we were a little more experienced, a little tougher,
Sure.
had 2 or 3 steps up on Mexico instead of 1, we might have overcome that. But that used to happen regularly. And that's only one sport. That's not even a sport where the judges have discretion. They're not supposed to have discretion. I lost with the University of Ottawa, Canadian National University Championships, because on match point, the referee didn't know it was match point, and for the first time in a 2.5-hour match, called my setter on a ball handling that the touch was just a little bit too long. Hadn't called that tight, called it on match point, boom, we're suddenly silver medalists. So people need to realize it is never fair. You have to be good enough, and I know because I wasn't a compliant athlete. If I hadn't been in the top 3 or 4 players on the team, I would have been more like occasionally made it, occasionally not. I had to make sure that any unfairness was not going to work against me because they needed to need me. And that's what competitive sport is about. You need to remove all the slightly ambivalent parts of it. So that's the first thing. When you come back now, a completely different side of the argument. I do think when parents say fair, that kid's tougher, that kid's taller, that kid's, I'm positive that kid used to be a boy. Like, there's 2 parts to that. First of all, if your kid isn't having fun, move your kid to a place where they're having fun. If you want the kid to get better, spend more time, it's just like in math or anything else. Get them a tutor, get them better. And as soon as you get good in sport, you need to play the boys, because the boys have had 10 years of development. As soon as we were a strong club team, or as soon as the national team was starting to get useful, we played men's teams every single week because nobody in the country could hit hard enough to prepare us for how Russia or Japan or Poland hit. So the notion of fairness is really a cop-out about not doing your work for your kid. And I'm happy to slam parents on that, because I watched my landlord, his little 7-year-old wants to be a pro soccer player. He is out there with that kid playing soccer, and so is his wife. They're both out there playing with that kid on a daily basis. And the kid has 2 different nets and cones set up and about 15 balls. And anytime he's got 10 spare minutes, he's out and shoots about 6 more goals. He's 7.
Good for him.
He's going to be a good soccer player. And it won't matter if the kids are 4 inches taller than him, because he's learning the stuff right now. So fair is a cop-out. And I think parents need to learn, if you want your kid to play for fun, get in there and pay attention and make sure that it's fun. If you want your kid to be a superstar, go get them more training. If you want them to be a superstar pianist, they'd be taking lessons 6 days a week. So there's an expectation in Canada, I think, and it's a privileged expectation, that sports should suddenly provide everybody with a complete pathway to the NHL. It doesn't work that way. And if you give your kid $800 worth of equipment, they're going to be treated better and have more access. Well, maybe sometimes it does work that way. And I'll tell you, that's not fair. Not all of us get the same equipment or the same gym. So, it's a false argument. And I will, because I can rant about this one. It's a false argument about transgender people.
That was going to be my next question as well. Yeah.
I can tell you, I've been accused of being transgender. I had like a hysterical time at a literary conference I was at 10 years ago. I've got my badge that says Betty on my chest. And this woman looks at me and says, "What do you like to be called?" And what do you like to be called? Like, long before the pronoun stuff came up, and I'm holding up my badge, it says Betty, right? So that same woman, we sit down to lunch, great big common tables. And I sit beside a fellow that I've seen occasionally, space at the table. And she's 2 down. She says, "Oh, I'm sitting beside 2 of the nicest men I've met at the conference." And the guy looks at me, and I kind of look and like hold up my name tag again, right? Like, so I have been accused of being transgender. I've been accused of being male. First of all, it's a fake argument. If someone has a dysphoria about their body, they are at such a disadvantage in any sport because they're uncomfortable in that body and they're trying to figure out a harmony, body-mind. You can't go anywhere in sport if you can't figure out a harmony between your body-mind. So one of the biggest crimes in our country right now is for the province of Alberta to ban adult transgender people from recreational sports. If you're 40 and you like to cross-country ski or go skating, and you're not allowed into the women's skating group or to a women's recreational cross-country ski race, that is criminal. That is the equivalent of Rosa Parks on the bus. It is just completely bigoted. So that's part of it. The other part is, if a transgender person plays sports and is doing well in sports, they're doing it because they've had that parent that has given them access and privilege and equipment. So they're not getting an advantage because their shoulders are broad or because they had male development. And I can tell you 100 times, when I was an elite athlete, I wished my shoulders were a little broader. And I hope, in the book, I pointed to the discus throw and tell my friend, like, are my shoulders as good as hers? Not a hope. So, like, get over it. These are 0.2%. There's less transgender people than there are redheads in the world. Like, it's just not an issue. It's a made up issue to satisfy extremely radical people who want white privileged people to have access to everything. And that's what's not fair. So I can get on a rant at it. And I have done work mostly in poverty reduction and done focus groups with transgender people. You cannot find more underprivileged people in our communities. All they want to do is be recognized for who they are in the grocery store. And they are slammed and thrown out and name called, and it's horrific. So if I can, in one sentence, be supportive of transgender people, I will, because they got a rough road to hoe. They've had to figure out, how does their body work? I read an article recently from Harrison Brown, who wrote the book, Let Us Play, with his sister Rachel Brown. It came out last year. That her description of him as a teenager, when he was playing sport, was the only time he felt happy, because the rest of the time he was fussing about trying to figure out, was he male, was he female? How could he find out this harmony for his body? So imagine taking a kid whose only happy place is to play and saying, you don't fit. And in the book that I've just done a blurb for, it's by Dan Gothrop, called The Cutting Edge. I think it's called Queer Sport History. I don't know what the subtitle is. Mm-hmm. He talks about even gay sport clubs having to get more overt and concrete in their acceptance of trans people, because the shower room is a disaster for a trans athlete. Like, needing to shower in their underwear or taking all their gear and go home sweaty and missing the connection or the beers after the game because everybody wants to look at their body and examine their genitals. Like, do we ban people because they've had a hysterectomy or because they've had a vasectomy? Like, get over it. It's personal, Yeah. So thanks for giving me time for that one, because I want the world to be more thoughtful about that one.
For sure. I can't speak to the sports aspect of it, but listeners will know that I'm a teacher by trade. That's what I do. And when you were talking about Alberta's policies, I was thinking also about how a lot of institutions, like educational institutions, and I'm speaking from here in Quebec, where we're seeing a crackdown on the way that we talk about trans people, right? As if it were some kind of taboo subject, right? Or something that we're not allowed to talk about, or something that is somehow going to, quote unquote, indoctrinate children into being different. And so we could feel free to rant. It's a maddening subject in many ways, but an important one. Yeah.
I actually think it's similar. Disability activists were raging against the government when the Constitution was repatriated. They've had to fight to include mental and physical disabilities. And it's because they were the easiest people to pick on. They were the easiest people to target. And that's exactly where we're at with trans people right now. It's a tiny percentage of the population and a tinier still percentage of them that play sports. And yet we're going to target them because we need somebody to victimize. And it is so irresponsible at government level, institutional level. It is so irresponsible. It's a made up issue. It just infuriates me. Anyway, there's that one.
So one of the things, because I'm seeing the time go by, and I do want to do a breadth of topics, or at least hit on a breadth of topics. One of the things that you talk about in your book is, your journey to being an activist. And you've mentioned this a few times in some of your questions. So for listeners who may not be aware, right, what exactly brought you into the world of activism, and what would you say is the main goal or drive behind your activism since being a professional athlete?
It's a good question. I think as an athlete, I mean, I was from a middle class family. I grew up in a small town, but I didn't really know what discrimination was. It just, it is what it is. Some kids have more money, some kids have less, some have access. But I had a supportive family, so I didn't feel like I was ever discriminated against. And it was more a protection mechanism that I wasn't able to be out, because you'd be pretty dumb to be out in the 70s and 80s without thinking there'd be a consequence. But when I was fired so blatantly, and when this people who had supported me, so like they were grooming me to be the coach, they spent tons of time and energy. When suddenly it wasn't even an issue, it was like you couldn't call it a penny dropping. It was more like a piano dropped on my head. Like, this is wrong. It is wrong, and it was like a night and day decision point, because I could have hated myself and said, okay, I will disappear. Or I could have, and I mentioned this in a podcast 2 days ago, or it was actually a little newspaper article in my local paper. I had to make the decision. I would be somebody who stood up. I would stand up. And although it seems, a little bit simple now, I was fired in January 82. And when I came back to Vancouver in May of 82, for probably the next 5 years, I said the lesbian word out loud in public every opportunity I could. And I would watch rooms go quiet, people take a breath. There was no visibility on television. There was no TV shows. There was no external stimulus whatsoever. And I just said it out loud. And even my own family, I mean, again, it's a lovely story. My own family, my nephew was getting married, and there was parties and, showers and stags and everything to help. And my whole family was helping him redo the floors of their house and paint. And one point, I think my sister or someone said to me, we all accept that you're gay, but why do you have to talk about it all the time? Well, I had a little hissy fit, I confess. And I just ranted at my family. I've been here for 2 days watching the energy and support go into my nephew's pre-marriage month so that everything will be perfect. And I said, and I moved into with my partner 4 months ago, and I didn't even get a frigging set of pots and pans. So just slam them, right? Well, you know that my mother features as a fairly strong character in the book. I go back to Vancouver, and UPS or some equivalent arrives at my door about a week later, and there's a huge cardboard box with a full set of pots and pans. And, it kind of, we had to have that slam, but I was the person who had support, but I realized that lots of people didn't. I knew people who's, they came out to their parents and they got their baby pictures ripped up and sent to them in a brown envelope. So I became that person that would stand up. And I also, when you ask what I'm fighting for, I want our systems to enable people to take part. I don't care whether it's our healthcare system, our political system, our elementary school sports, professional sports, access to education, access to being out in the forest. I think that nobody owns access to having a good life. And if we don't address poverty, or we don't address body shaming, or we don't address, and this I will use the word fairness, because it's fair access to understand your body and be healthy, then we can't really call ourselves a civilized society. So, I may have started out as an activist for LGBT rights, and as those rights expanded to become, lots of people call us the alphabet people, but it that was narrow. But as I learned more, both about the violence against some parts of the LGBT community, and I also learned about literally the disadvantages for women and for immigrants and for poor people, we got a lot of work to do. So I just try to do what I can, and I'm quite proud. Like, I have to say, and we'll say it out loud, especially since I'm talking to Eastern Canada and not my little tiny village here in Sunshine Coast. I was angry because I thought that our white male representative on our little regional district was not being appropriate and was not acknowledging the work that his constituencies needed. And so I thought, well, we need more women to run. And so I didn't have anybody to sponsor it, but I phoned up a local elected politician and said, I want to run a workshop for women who think they might put their name in for municipal politics. And let's talk about the ropes. I used to be a school trustee. Some of us know how to do this. Nobody would sponsor us. So we decided we would just fly by the seat of our pants. That workshop was 2 weeks ago tomorrow. Yeah, so it was February 28th. We thought we might get 20 people. We had 38 women show. The age range was 18 to 83. There were 10 elected officials there to share their experience. There was no structure. There was no experts in the room. I did some facilitating, which I don't do very much anymore because I'm getting old. And we had a panel of elected officials that said, ask us anything. You know, why are you afraid? What are the downsides? What are the upsides? Why do we do it? Do we like what we do? Are we running again? And the energy in that room, we spent 5 hours together, and the energy was phenomenal. People went out saying like, well, even if I don't run, I'm going to support somebody who does. And 2 or 3, you know, since emailed me back and said, you know, I picked up a nomination package. I'm going to put my name forward. And I felt like, you know, that's what it's about. Nobody was saying, if you do it, here's your formula. People were just saying, let's put 40 people in a room and talk about how we can help. And it was nonpartisan. There was probably, you know, every range of the political belief ideology in the room, but everybody loved it. And you know, we the nice thing is we maybe spent $700 or $800, but we asked people to kick in $20 at the door if they could, and we had $600 that we were able to give to social services for help young families that need help with mental health. So win-win-win. And you know, haven't done it. It takes a lot. I don't think I could actually have the energy to do it more than about once every 5 years. But it felt like that moment of activism where you don't go like, oh, everybody's bad. Let's kind of figure out something and create a new plan.
Mm-hmm. And to add on to this, as someone who has engaged here and there with activism, but not particularly regularly, we tend to think of activism as like this grand thing, right? These big protests or these, you know, major events. But, and this is not to diminish at all what you just said. I think it's very comforting in many ways. And I'm happy to hear stories like this of communities coming together, right? 40 people and changing potentially someone's life with it. It's a fantastic thing to hear.
There was one person that was a municipal staffer, and I said, you're welcome to attend, but just make sure you're attending and not just observing. She emailed me after and said, I can't tell you how inspiring it was to see so many women that care about democracy and want to do it right and want to make sure they can do it in a positive way. I just like that, you know, that was my feedback. I just was so thrilled. And the young woman that was 18 there, oh man, you know, I'm going to take her a gift book and give it to her because people are going to put her down, and I want her to know it's okay to get up and do it again. You know?
For sure. Yeah.
All good.
I have 2 questions that I want to kind of wrap up with. So as you've mentioned before, you basically wrote a memoir at the end of the day. And I'm curious what it's like looking back on all of these various moments, right? There's some that we've kind of haven't touched upon, right? Going to Cuba, for example, the Montreal Olympic Games, coaching, you know, looking back on all these moments as a life lived, right? What was your engagement like, or how did your view on these moments change with hindsight, right? Sometimes 30, 40, 50 years of hindsight, if at all.
I think it changed a lot. I'm quite a bit more mellow. I'm quite a bit more mellow now than I was when I was 25 and 30. But I think what really helped me write the book is I had to see it as third person. I'm not that 18-year-old anymore, nor am I that 29-year-old that got fired, nor am I that, you know, activist that really wanted to change the world, nor am I the candidate for MP at age 41. I'm not that person anymore. But when I could see them as third person, I thought, I want the reader to know who that person is and know why she made those choices and what hurt and what was exhilarating. And so that enabled me to, it wasn't just distance, because you know, everything in that book happened to me. It's true. But I wanted to be able to put it in such a way that it wasn't as much about me as it was about the choices and the obstacles and the exhilarating overcoming. And that helped a lot. And I think the other thing that helped, and you know, haven't said this to a lot, but I think I might need to say it more. I had cancer. And when you have cancer, you kind of realize, like, I don't get to control tomorrow or the next day or anything in the past, but I can be as real as I can, and I can try and do better. And so I think there was a patience with myself. And, you know, I read a lot of writers that helped, and one of the ones that helped a lot was Anne Padgett, an American writer who, she has a essay, if you ever get a chance to read it, it's called The Getaway Car, which the whole book should have been called that, but the essay, The Getaway Car, is outstanding. And she talks about what you have to do as a writer is agree to forgive yourself every day, because the first draft is horrible, and you're trying to create this beautiful thing that's in your head, and you put it on the page and it's ugly, and you have to work and work and work to make it even a close proximity to what the beautiful thing in your head is. And I love that, because I needed to be able to forgive myself for not being good at it. And you know, it's easy for me to work hard with my body. I can still go out and do way too much work in the garden or hike too high a trail with my dog. But it was hard for me to learn how to work hard at writing, because it's a different kind of intellectual process that I'd had no experience in, really, because although I got through school and a graduate degree, I didn't really pay much attention to learning how to do it properly. So that was huge. And I think it also let me reflect. And if I can, Patrick, you said I recently, I'm going to read one paragraph. My niece, who's a writer, she's a Jane Austen scholar and has just done a very good novel about Jane Austen. But she said this is her favorite passage from the book. So I looked it up and I remembered writing it, and I thought it was somewhere late in the book, but look, it's actually in the first third. And it's after that time in Cuba. And it was because I was thinking about Brittany Griner being released from prison in Russia, and how she said I can read half a page here. In answer to the interview's question, this is 2023 in April, she's in a CBC interview. In answer to an interview's question as to how she was able to cope, Griner said, "I'm no stranger to hard times, just digging deep. I relied on hard work to get through it." That's the quote. This is now my voice. I recognized a sparkling edge of absolute truth in those words. Training helped her endure racism, hardship, and the brutality of incarceration. In later life, when my friend Sharon and I shared a property, this lesson proved useful. Sharon was facing a 30-day preparation for an iodine treatment needed to address thyroid cancer, and was very distressed about the diet required and the lack of continuing her normal level of physical activity. She told me that it had helped immensely when I told her, "Sharon, just train. It's 30 days. You know how to do it. Just focus and do it." In my own life, hard training always helped me deepen my trust in myself and calm my mind when confronting discrimination, illness, or high stress. There is a depth of strength in each of us that enables us to endure tremendous physical distress. But we only learn about ourselves when pushed to extremes. We learn to focus our psyche not on the pain, but on gratitude for small, successful steps, and the knowledge that each moment will build steadfastly toward the best possible outcome, maybe even peace or success. And that's the paragraph that my niece sent me just yesterday and said, "This is my favorite paragraph in the whole book." And I think, in answer to your question, I was able to talk from who I am now about whether it was illness or distress or extremely hard training. And when Brittany Griner was interviewed, I was thinking, yeah, if you had trained hard enough to be a pro athlete, you know about getting through tough times. And it made me want to put that out to people, because I hope people see that there's lessons in this book that aren't just about sport. It's about how to know who you are and how powerful, back to women and their bodies, how powerful you can be if you're at peace and let yourself learn about your body and your capacity to overcome distress.
Absolutely.
It's kind of a nice moment to end on, isn't it?
Yeah, no, for sure. It's better than the question I perhaps was going to end on, but I can see why a Jane Austen scholar would appreciate that passage. Yes. I have to admit, I see a lot of parallels there, and the English major in me could talk for ages about the free and direct discourse and all of that.
Let me do a blurb for her book. Her book.
Yeah, exactly.
Her book is called The Austens. Her name is Sarah Emsley. She's my oldest brother's daughter, Sarah Emsley, and she basically fictionalized the relationship between Jane Austen and her sister-in-law who lived in Bermuda. So the book is constructed through a series of their letters back and forth, where they struggle in many ways with their role as women, and their role is challenged, where Jane Austen's role in particular was challenged because she refused marriage and it chose her art, and the other woman accepted marriage and reduced her power in the world in some ways. So it's a very good book. It's called The Austens, and it's fiction. It's her first fiction. She's written a number of things that have been more literary academic.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. One of the last questions I have, or the last question I had, was on your choice of structure, essentially. So you end, or your final chapters are on the gay games, right? And I'm curious, when you were thinking of the book and its construction, what prompted you to end on this particular moment? In my mind, when I was reading it, it reads as a rather hopeful end, right? But I obviously don't want to put intent into your work necessarily. So I'm curious why you decide to end at that specific moment.
It was a hopeful moment, and I also, memoirs need a container, and I was quite clear that I couldn't ramble on about my life forever. And to me, the container of from a young athlete that loves sport to an adult who's been through much of the trauma and success of sport, to see the gay games as a place of celebration. And I give credit to the city of Vancouver because, it was just going to be another games until the arts and culture community basically said, we can do this. We can make this a place where people have, and I can't emphasize enough. I mean, there was 3 theaters that ran gay plays and dancing and music and bands and swing dance, like everything under the sun, which meant that there was really a parallel cultural celebration. And the joy that was evident in those 8 days, it profoundly changed people's lives. So when people ask me, what would you hope for the sports system? I would hope that the sports system could be as welcoming in a million little ways as those gay games were. And that it enabled me to, it really worked for the story arc, because I felt like, I started optimistically and I ended optimistically, and there was a lot of ups and downs. So it worked for the story arc, but I do give credit to the Nightwood folks. Silas White is the publisher. He read the book and he said, I think it's time for us to get the story out. And I was thrilled, of course. But he also said, your epilogue doesn't give us enough depth. He says, you don't need another chapter, but you need to tell us, what about sport now? And so the epilogue, he gave me a nudge and I went back and wrote. So I tell people the book ends on the high and the joy of the gay games, and the epilogue ends with a punch that says, we better pay attention because it is not good and it could get a lot worse. And I think that was wise, because you can't kind of drop something 30 years ago. And in some ways, I'm pleased that there's so much attention for that bracket of my life, that 20 years that ended in 1990. But it's true, we have to look at how it affects today's issues. So in part, it worked. I didn't know that it's like people tell stories, write themselves. I didn't know what the arc was going to be till I was about 2/3 of the way through. And then I thought, no, I didn't want to end on the firing, because that felt too down. And it was a big part of my life those last few years, helping with the gay games. And it helped me turn around. I went from being devastated to being a leader in a whole different way. Yeah. And that was very positive for me.
Absolutely. One question that I ask every guest, and it's kind of journalism 101, and it's just a question I like. What did I not ask during this interview? And what's the answer to that question?
Yeah. Well, I think we had a pretty good discussion. I'm not sure that you didn't. Lots of people have asked me, why did this take you 50 years to write this story? And the answer is, I couldn't see the story. In part, I tried to write an essay in 2012-13, and it went into a book that was a book of way too many essays about the history of women in sport in Canada. And I was angry. The essay was about me, and I was angry. And I'm not angry anymore. I am grateful that I learned so much and that I was able to get this book done at a time when sport I would say sport is having a moment in Canada right now. People are watching. The headlines still feature something good or bad in sport almost every day. So to get it out there, that it adds to the discourse is really important to me. And but I think that's really what people have been asking me is, why? And there's a quote by Maya Angelou I just read a few days ago that says, there's nothing more uncomfortable than a story that wants to be told and you're trying to get it out. And I can tell you, it's felt very good this last year to, working on the minutia of the publication process, but it is taken on its own life. Like, this book will do whatever it needs to do in people's hands. And I'm grateful that it's out in the world.
Absolutely. Well, Betty, I cannot thank you enough for the time that you have spent talking to me. It's been truly wonderful. Yeah. And tells me about a whole side, like I said, that I have very little awareness of the sports world in general. And I really appreciate both your book and this interview for that. So for listeners who would be interested, I forget, when does the book come out? Is it already out?
The book was out last week. The publication date was the 10th. And it should be in most bookstores now. I will be doing, I'm actually going to be speaking at the North American Association of Sport Historians in May. I will be speaking at the Toronto Public Library, June 18th. And I'm just working on a gig with the Halifax Central Library for August, as well as my local Writers' Fest is August as well. So there's lots of activities. Hopefully it will stay kind of in the milieu of being talked about for 4 or 5 more months. And you said you were in Quebec. Are you in Montreal?
Yes.
Okay. There's a community center, and I'm going to get the initials wrong, but I have gifted that community center. I think it's 3 or 4 books. So if people can't afford the books or it's not at their library, if they go to that community center, they can pick up a free copy I don't know how they system, but certainly they have copies there that would be able to be borrowed. So that's one of the things I didn't mention, and I want to. I received a grant from the LGBT Purge Fund to help promote the book. And as part of that grant, I have 100 copies to give away. And I have given away just over 50. So I'm still looking, the publicist is looking for some. I've basically said I will give them to activist groups, youth groups, LGBT groups that would not be able to purchase them. And so if you know of any, feel free to pass on. They can get in touch with Nicole. And we're still going to ship another 40 or more books across the country.
Wonderful. I will certainly, I'll certainly pass along anything that I can think of.
Hope. It's more than a word. It's a breakthrough in the making. At City of Hope, we're pushing the boundaries of science, targeting cancer at the molecular level, with teams of experts working together to personalize a treatment plan right down to your DNA with unprecedented speed, making every second count with appointments in as little as 24 hours. City of Hope, advancing cancer care at life-saving speed. Learn more at cityofhope.org.